I'm Pat Doris. Welcome to The Story and welcome to Friday. Hey, what comes to mind when you hear the term bar exam? For many of you legal types out there, I know you may have shuddered just at the thought of that. Data shows that around 40% of people who take the bar exam to become lawyers fail. But this week, the Oregon Supreme Court unanimously approved an optional plan that would let folks skip the bar exam and still get a license to practice law. Oh, yes, they did. And that's our big story tonight. I have two sisters who are lawyers in Washington State, and when I first heard about this, I said, "You got to be kidding me." I remember how intense it was for them, but it was hard, but it made them better. Isn't that the way it's supposed to be? At least I think they did. They're awesome now. They're fantastic lawyers. So how crazy is that people can skip the bar exam? But it turns out there's actually quite a bit of thought that went into the decision, and a lot of smart people think it is going to make for better lawyers. So let's dig in. Starting in May of next year, a program called the Supervised Practice Portfolio Examination, that's a mouthful, will be given in Oregon. Law school graduates who choose to go that route will be able to practice in Oregon without taking the bar exam. Instead, they'll have to prove themselves by actually doing the job that they studied for. Requirements include 675 hours of practice under the supervision of a licensed Oregon attorney. That's a little over 4 months of 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. That number was not plucked out of the sky, by the way. That's understood to be the general amount of time that someone would spend studying for the bar exam. Next, they'll have to submit a portfolio of their work. It'll be made up of 8 different projects. Each one of those has to be delivered to a board of bar examiners who will give it a thumbs up or thumbs down grade. It's the same way that current bar exams are graded today. Now, I know that many of you are sitting back on this Friday night thinking to yourselves, here's another example of Oregon softening the rules, and it will degrade the very important jobs that lawyers do day in and day out. Well, we wondered about that ourselves. So we spoke with the dean of the Willamette University's law school, Brian Galini, who helped craft the new program. He put it to us like this: would you rather have a lawyer who can pass a test or one who's already done hundreds of hours of the actual work that you're now asking them to do?
It reminds me of like, do you remember when BlackBerries were out? And the iPhone came along and everyone said, oh, the iPhone's not gonna go anywhere. I'm tied to my BlackBerry. That was the phrase. But who has a BlackBerry anymore? I think today's bar exam is the BlackBerry, and what this is the iPhone. And we're in that period of resistance where it's like, no, we're so used to doing it this way and accepting it this way that I'm tied to my BlackBerry. But I think it's important to remember as we move into a different line of thinking, what we're doing now, it would be the equivalent if we said to doctors, look, just draw out how you would do the surgery. I don't want you to practice. Or to pilots, like just think about flying the plane, or like just, write that out, but don't fly it. And so you and I show up for our flight and the pilot's like, it's my first flight, but don't worry. I've written about flying and I've taken some multiple choice. I haven't actually flown the plane, but you'll be fine. That's what we do in law right now. When if people really focused on what this current exam is doing, I think they'd be far more alarmed that they have the attorney who passed this as opposed to the attorney who's going to be asked to do the sorts of things that the SPPE is going to ask candidates to do.
So that SPPE is the acronym for the new program, by the way, Supervised Practice Portfolio Examination. Galini points to some big questions about the bar exam that have recently come to light, especially when it comes to equity. Data from the American Bar Association in 2021 showed that broadly, there's a 15% difference between white prospective lawyers passing the bar compared to prospective lawyers of color.
Does this bar exam protect the public? And so, well, in order to know that, we got to know what we're testing. Well, presumably we're testing minimum competence, but as it turns out, there is no evidence-based definition of minimum competence. Oh, well, that's concerning. Well, what are we doing? Well, we're using multiple choice and essay questions that are closed book and timed. And so, well, okay, if we've got racially disparate results, we've got no definition of minimum competence, surely multiple choice and short essay closed book, surely that matches what lawyers do. Well, no lawyer completes a multiple choice question or completes a closed book short answer essay in their practice.
And then there's the cost of the bar exam. Galini tells us that typically the courses to prep for the bar run around $4,000, and that's after law school graduation. It's around 6 months total of studying, taking the test, and waiting for the score with little to no income on the side, probably for most people, while they have to continue putting food on the table and keeping a roof over their head.
Ask any graduate who has taken the bar exam whether they felt like the second they walked across the graduation stage, they were ready to practice law. And the answer overwhelmingly is no. And all of those things leads to one question, which is, why are we doing it this way?
And he says that led to the creation of this program. It's taken shape over the past 3 years, finally receiving approval from the Oregon State Supreme Court on Tuesday of this past week. Once it begins in May of next year, it will be open to all graduates of law schools across the country that are accredited by the American Bar Association, which is great. But Galini says one of the weaknesses of the new program is that people who go through it instead of taking the bar exam will only have a license to practice right here in Oregon. And that is a big difference. Those who pass the traditional bar exam can practice in any of these states in orange, depending on your score. These are states that have adopted the so-called uniform bar exam, which is scored out of 400. The bar exam in Oregon is not going away. Students can still take that one if they want. The cut score for the traditional bar exam is 270. Score lower than that in Oregon, and you do not get a license. You do get to take the test again, though.
We see real issues with trying to compete in the licensure space, and by we, I mean the state of Oregon, with every other state that accepts that portable score, because you're not really giving that candidate the ability to say, well, we want to focus you on the issues in Oregon. Now, one way to think about that is, okay, now candidates have fewer options. That's kind of the negative and the drawback. But the positive way of thinking about that is if we can encourage students to think about how they would leverage their licensure in state sooner in their law school experience, I think that gives us a better shot at attorney retention. I personally, taking my committee hat off and putting my dean hat on, I see a lot of students who want the flexibility that a portable license provides. And I think we got some work to do to convince them that, hey, you should spend 675 hours as opposed to just you could bang this out in 2 days. So I think we got some work to do on that front.
I think a lot of lawyers would agree with him. Galini says that while Oregon is the first state to implement something like this, we're not all that unique in the idea anyway. Several other states are on the path toward making this a reality as well. California is likely next. The state of Washington is looking at multiple pathways towards a law license instead of the bar exam. Wisconsin and New Hampshire have special licensing programs. Maine, Nevada, Utah, North Dakota, Georgia, and Minnesota, they're all considering licensure reforms as well. So what about you? What do you think about this new program that allows lawyers to skip the bar exam? What are the pros and cons that come to mind? Let us know, will you? You can email us right here at thestory@kgw.com. You could also call and leave a voicemail. The number is 503-226-5090. Now let's get to some of your comments on our show last night. We covered a variety of issues, from a mom searching for her homeless son on Portland streets to Measure 110 and takeaways from folks who went on a trip to Portugal to see it there. Plus the news yesterday of the delayed enforcement for Portland's daytime camping ban that was supposed to start this coming Monday. First, let's start with the comments on Blair Best's heartbreaking story last night. An Eastern Oregon mom recently diagnosed with a terminal illness, walking Portland's streets, trying to find her addicted son before time runs out for both of them. On our YouTube video page, Catherine wrote, "Maybe if we invested in a place where the homeless could get treatment, a place where they could be together, we wouldn't have such despair on the streets. Addiction is bad enough without being homeless, and if you were homeless, you would have to be addicted to put up with it." Then we talked about Measure 110 and what's on the horizon for the drug decriminalization law. Some big names in Oregon business have given lawmakers an ultimatum: fix 110 during the short session next year, including recriminalizing public drug use, or they will put an initiative on the ballot to let voters decide what to do with it. Martha wrote to us about that. Portland has done this backward. You do the infrastructure first, and then you do the extra structure. Portland did it just the opposite. And when it comes to a pause on enforcing Portland's daytime camping ban, Kenneth sent us an email with a message we hear often when we're talking about decisions involving the homeless. Move those campers to the judge's neighborhood and see if she changes her mind.
I guess I feel there's going to come a point where we're going to have to override people's civil rights when they don't want help. Because I don't know what else you do. If you want to put a tent in front of my business and I don't want it there, I've offered you help, you will not take it, but you will continue to have your tent in front of my business, that's just not right. And I don't know why people turn down help, but I think we're going to come to a point where we're going to have to impose help on people, period.
Now, if you missed our show last night, you'll certainly want to head over to KGW YouTube channel to check it out. And this is a reminder to all of us, all of you, all of us, if you ever miss us live here on TV, we do update our YouTube channel every night with full episodes and individual segments. Check us out. Let's end with this comment from a longtime viewer named Marty. Thank you to you and all of your staff and contributors that make your show possible. This is one of the best local news shows, and I'm so grateful that you present this to us every day. Well done and appreciated. Thank you, Marty. Marty emails us quite often, and yes, we do recognize many of you who communicate with us a lot, and we appreciate you. Keep all your comments coming through email and voicemail. We really do love it. Still to come on the story. We're going to take a break from all of our people problems to talk about wolves. It was not that long ago that only a handful of wolves called Oregon home, but their numbers are definitely growing. And a new video helps illustrate their incredible journeys across the West. We'll explain right after this. Let's talk about wolves in Oregon. They've really expanded over the last several years, from just 4 in 2009 to 178 at the end of 2022. This graphic from the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife shows you where the various packs are located. Lots up there in northeast Oregon, but several in central Oregon as well. The state also keeps a running list of confirmed wolf kills, that is, animals like cows that are killed by the wolves. It's a long list with narrations explaining things like the fact that lethal permits are authorized for removal of a certain number of wolves from a specific pack. In other words, professional hunters are brought in to kill them because the wolves are killing too many of the livestock in the area. At the same time, the state has recently released a video showing some of the journeys that young wolves are taking across the West, which is just fascinating. The video explains that yearling wolves often leave their pack. It's an urge to find a new territory or mate, sometimes both. Since 2010, the state has been tranquilizing and collaring wolves to put GPS trackers on them so researchers can follow their journeys throughout Oregon and the West. Here's one example. A yearling from the Chestninimus pack crosses Interstate 84 and then traveled 246 miles over the next 9 days. He averaged 10 to 15 miles each day and each night until he came to the foothills of the Cascades. There he found a carcass and ate, then he rested for a full day before moving on. Here's another, OR 93. He left the White River Pack in Central Oregon and traveled south. Eventually, he crossed into California and continued south to the Sierra Nevada range. He traveled within 5 miles of Reno and Fresno and then crossed Interstate 5 in California on his way toward the ocean. Researchers say that most yearlings like this are looking for forested areas with deer and elk to start a new pack, and they continue to travel if they don't find a good location and a good mate. Eventually, OR 93 was found dead after being hit by a vehicle 60 miles north of Los Angeles. Here's another journey, this one beginning with a yearling female who settled just outside the area where she was born in Northeast Oregon. She met up with a yearling male who came from the Snake River Pack. His journey took him 650 miles before he turned back toward home and met his mate 60 miles from where he was raised. And then there's Oregon's most famous wolf, OR 7, who went on a 4,500-mile journey. OR 7 left Northeast Oregon and traveled south and west near Burns, then continued south across the California border. It was big news. He was the first confirmed wolf to return to California in almost 90 years. He spent a year there before heading back north. Books were written about him, and the network news covered his journey. A year and a half after he started his epic trek, OR 7 found a mate in southwest Oregon. The two started the Rogue Pack and raised pups for the next 6 years. As of 2020, OR 7 has not been seen and is now presumed dead. He was likely 11 years or older, which ODFW says is quite old for a wolf in the wild. Oregon has so many wolves now that 10 of them are being shipped to the state of Colorado to try and restore packs there. That work gets underway next month. If you'd like to learn more about wolves in Oregon, you can check out the full wolf dispersal video on ODFW's YouTube page. It's quite good. Coming up next on The Story, from one predator to another, we're talking about grizzly bears. The feds are seriously considering several plans to reintroduce grizzlies to the North Cascades in the great state of Washington. Our Environmental Northwest team has all the details when The Story returns. Well, we just told you about wolves in Oregon. Now let's talk about bears in Washington. You have a few more days to voice your opinion on whether or not grizzly bears should be reintroduced to the North Cascades. It's been decades since one has been spotted there, but the feds are looking at a few different plans to bring them back. Leah Pizzetti with our Environment Northwest team visited the area where this could happen and shows us the options on the table.
Here in the North Cascades, this is where grizzly bears used to call home. But it's been decades since they've been seen here, and a plan to bring them back is years in the making.
So many people have become unwilling to share even the remotest places on Earth with other creatures.
It's a question that will soon be answered. Should grizzlies return to the North Cascades?
This is a cause we've supported. I am of the firm belief that humans and grizzlies can get along together.
Or not?
Is absolutely false.
These are people that farm, people that have cattle, people that have children.
The community sharing opinions as leaders
The
listen.
number one question that I get in 18 years of my campground, do we have to worry about bears?
This listening session is one of many, as Washington leaders decide whether or not to move forward with plans to reintroduce grizzly bears to the North Cascades.
They were lost here because of people. This is a story of people killing bears.
North Cascades Wildlife Program Supervisor Jason Ransom says it's been more than 25 years since U.S. officials confirmed seeing a grizzly in the North Cascades. Fish and Wildlife's Wayne Casewarn says it's their past here that makes this a considered place to nurse the species back to health after being declared endangered in 1975.
It is a place where historically we had grizzly bears.
Part of that federal mandate, a requirement to help the bear population recover wherever it's possible.
We have a significant opportunity to recover grizzly bears in this area.
In the city at Seattle's Woodland Park Zoo, there is one grizzly bear.
Fern came to us from Montana.
Conservation scientist Robert Long says bears and humans already coexist in the wild right now.
People in Washington, especially people in the Cascades, tend to live and hike with bears all the time. They're black bears. And a lot of the same things that you would tend to do to make sure you're hiking safely or living safely among black bears is the same thing with grizzly bears.
With this plan to potentially bring grizzlies back, Washington has 3 options on the table. Alternative A would bring no change. No grizzlies added. The current endangered species rules stay in place. Alternatives B and C each gradually bring 25 bears through a multi-year span. Ultimately, the goal would be to grow to 200 bears, which could take 60 to 100 years. B would keep the current endangered species rule in place. C would create new rules. One major change would give landowners more rights to protect their animals if other preventative steps have been taken with Fish and Wildlife already.
In certain circumstances, we could issue a lethal take permit to a landowner to kill a grizzly bear that has been offending by taking livestock.
But that would be rare. In parts of the U.S. where thousands of bears live and millions of people visit, there are only 7 bear attacks on people every year on average, with less than 1 resulting in death. In the Selkirk ecosystem in northeastern Washington, which has a comparable number of grizzlies to the Cascades plan, there have been 2 people injured in the last 42 years. An experience Alexandra and Luke Davis came face to face with.
He was definitely more than a nuisance. He was a threat and a danger.
Their family lives near the Selkirk Recovery Zone, where an estimated 50 grizzly bears live on the U.S. side.
And as you can see, the fence here, he pushed through.
One repeatedly came to their property, ripping through fences and killing chickens, even tearing into a bear-proof bin.
He took the barrel and was probably 10 feet from our daughter's window, and that's when the mama bear in me comes out, and I'm like, hey, this bear needs to be dealt with.
They called Fish and Wildlife, who set up cameras and eventually traps. Then they successfully sedated the bear and moved it.
Once you move into these areas, you know that we already know that they're in this area, but it doesn't mean we have to tolerate when they're tearing down our fence, eating our chickens.
But they do not support the idea of more in the North Cascades.
I think if they do go forward with the reintroduction, people really need to educate themselves on what's getting dropped in their backyard.
The bulk of grizzlies' diets do consist of berries, but the state's report shows that in Montana from 2019 to 2022, grizzlies killed an average of 65 cattle and 34 sheep each year. But there are thousands of grizzlies living there. There is one key part of the puzzle that will influence the future of grizzlies in the Cascades: what happens in the North Cascades in Canada.
Our nation, the Syilx Nation, has always recognized grizzly bears, Kelowna, as protected and sort of a cornerstone, a pillar of cultural integrity and landscape and ecosystem health.
Okanagan Nation Alliance's Kaylin Glasser says in British Columbia, the First Nations are moving forward with plans to reintroduce grizzlies to their side of the Cascades as early as 2024, meaning they eventually will end up in the U.S.
They're going to travel across the border. That's a given. We know that.
Some of those bears will certainly find their way south, and we will have them in this ecosystem. And so the question is not so much, if we want to have bears here, because bears will probably find their way here. It's what tools do we want to have to coexist with them?
That's why state leaders say they prefer the third option, which allows them to create new rules, but that can only happen if there are no grizzlies already. And with grizzlies eventually moving to the North Cascades from Canada, there is a small window of time to set up the new rules before they get here.
How much do you weigh the locals and residents and visitors versus Native American and First Nation voices versus the actual bears themselves?
That's a great question. Grizzly bears is certainly a high-profile issue. It's a very complex issue, and there's a huge diversity of values and opinions of different stakeholder groups. It's complex.
Sifting through the different opinions, figuring out what's best for the North Cascades. For Environment Northwest, I'm Leah Pizzetti.
Super interesting, but it sounds like one way or another the bears are coming. The public comment period is open through Monday of next week. You can submit your thoughts on the National Park Service website under the North Cascades National Park section. A final decision is expected in the spring. Hey, that's the end of our show. Thanks so much for watching. And remember, the story, our collective story, that never ends. Make sure you tune in all next week for a special series I've been working on for months. It's all about contaminated water in Eastern Oregon. Part 1 is Monday at 6:30. I'll see you then.